Hello, my name is Susan Hirata. Welcome to the 17th Annual DisOrient Asian American Film Festival. One of the things I love most about DisOrient is talking about our films. They say you haven't fully seen a film until you've talked about it. So I hope you are engaging in conversations about the films you're watching and that you are enriched, entertained, and inspired by the work of our filmmakers. Today, it's my pleasure to have a film conversation with the filmmakers of Omoiyari, a song film by Ishibashi. With us today, we have writer-director Kaoru Ishibashi and one of the subjects in the film, Erin Aoyama. Ishibashi is the pseudonym of Kaoru Ishibashi, an internationally acclaimed Japanese-American songwriter and multi-instrumentalist. Having graduated from the Berklee College of Music with a degree in film scoring, Ishibashi has been rapidly bridging the gap between pop music and orchestral music. A virtuoso improvising violinist, he has toured with and collaborated with Regina Spektor and indie band of Montreal. He has appeared on many late-night TV shows, and his original music has been featured on major commercial TV campaigns. In 2012, NPR Music named Ishibashi Best New Artist. Omoiyari is his first documentary feature film. Erin Aoyama is a subject in the film. Currently based in Rhode Island, Erin is finishing up her doctoral work at Brown University. She is a curatorial assistant at the Japanese American National Museum in LA and works on various projects for the Minidoka National Historic Site and for the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. Erin and Kay, welcome to DisOrient.
Hi.
Hey, tell us where you're zooming in from today, both of you.
Montana.
I'm normally based in Rhode Island, but I'm dog sitting for my parents in Connecticut this weekend.
So are we spanning like 3 different time zones right now?
Absolutely.
Yeah, cool.
Took me a second to figure
Cool.
it out.
So we are so honored to have Omoiyari in our 2022 program. I'm even actually just thrilled to have the word Omoiyari in our program, written in our program. I'm hoping that it somehow imbues this spirit of compassion to our entire festival. So thank you for that. We have shown many films on Japanese incarceration. Omoiyari is really effective in that it covers US history and the history of Japanese Americans while framing all of it in the context of an artist's personal journey. I think this is what makes the film really impactful. When did you decide this personal journey would be a film? And what was the vision both you and your co-director, Justin Taylor Smith, had for this film?
First of all, thank you for screening the film. We're very honored to be a part of your festival. So actually, Erin Aoyama, who's was on the really first trip that we went, I was commissioned to write a piece, which is featured in the film for orchestra. And so I wanted to do research about it, and I had learned that there's a trip going out there from a gang of Brown University grad students was going out to do an informational like discussion travel group during the summer, like 2 weeks. And I thought that was kind of perfect, because it's something that I wanted to see for myself, and to also like to be connected with the community, because I'm a post-war immigrant, so I'm not, I have no familial connection, but to be able to connect with people where this is a family history, a legacy. This is something I wanted to connect to that community. And so Erin, so I took a filmmaker with me and I did music there, and Erin was actually a part of that trip, and she saw the beginning of this whole process. We didn't know at the time that it would become a feature-length film.
And then you and Justin got together when you decided this was going to be a film.
Yeah, so Justin's I worked on with a lot of action sports films, like as a composer, and so. Like,
okay. Yeah. So that's your connection with Justin.
Yeah, and he's a brilliant like cinematographer, editor of like music and action sports. and so like snowboarding and surfing and stuff like that. So he, just having going to these incarceration sites, he was able to, working in outdoor spaces, he's just really good. And also he's very empathetic to minority identity. And so he really followed me in my growth. And he's met Erin many times, and we're all going to convene. We all have convened a month ago when we premiered the movie.
That's good. That's good. Erin, so we are focusing a lot on storytelling this year at DisOrient. In fact, we are having or have had a panel discussion about storytelling because I felt like so many of our submissions really were focusing on the power of storytelling. And in the film, you mentioned that there is a lot of power in sharing stories. So tell us more about this, because this is your realm, stories, right? And you're digging up these stories and you're listening to people tell these stories. So tell us about that.
Right. Well, and I think it's fun, Kay, to think back to that first trip together like 4.5 years ago at this point, because in a lot of ways, I think that was sort of the beginning of my journey into this world of storytelling. And, I'm a historian technically, and I've always loved American history because the first time I was sort of introduced to history in elementary school, it was this series of stories about the American Revolution and all of these places and people, that we could see around where I grew up. And so I think it planted this idea in my head as a kid that history was, just stories about people. And because of, I think, how we're often taught American history, and especially growing up in New England, I didn't learn any Asian American history until my senior year of college, when I decided to learn about this side of my family that I just had never, learned all that much about. We grew up not around a lot of other Asian Americans, let alone Japanese Americans. And so I think then starting, going on this trip with Kay and watching you, Kay, explore some of these questions about your own identity and this idea of a community, of a Japanese American community, and what it meant to return to these sites was a really powerful beginning for me in a lot of ways too. Getting to know this Japanese American community that now is such a huge part of my life in so many ways, but really seeing the way that asking questions about where you come from and what your community is and how it became the way that it is a way into then understanding the present, right? And so I focus a lot on Japanese American history. I am so lucky to spend a lot of time with elders and with folks all over the place, all over the US, but really around the world, who have various connections to things like incarceration or displacement. And it's been a way for me to, I think, learn a lot about my own family. My grandparents, as so many other grandparents and Nisei, didn't talk about their experience during World War II. So it's been a way to sort of learn about them and sort of understand, honor them and their memories, but also a way to learn about other communities. I think one of the things that I learned traveling with UK and Justin, as you guys were filming, was that when you sort of put yourself out there, when you tell your story and are open about the things you don't know and the questions you have, there's a way that kind of breaks down certain barriers or breaks down sort of walls between experiences. And it's a way of saying, we don't have the same stories, but we have stories, and I want to share mine with you, and I want you to share yours with me. So I think in sort of a community person to person way, storytelling is so powerful. And as a tool for learning history and thinking about what justice can look like and what our future should look like, understanding where we come from and the choices and the structures that have gotten us here is the way to sort of think about what the path forward might look like. So for me, storytelling is just fun. It's really fun and it's really meaningful, but it also has this very real power, I think, to bring about change.
I think that even relates back to just Omoiyari. I mean, that's how you can, get into what the experience of someone else is, right? Is like sharing your stories and being vulnerable about sharing your stories. That's how we connect, like you said. It's really beautiful. Also, Erin, so in the film, like we're actually seeing you discover like actual history that your parents were here. What was it like to have this tangible evidence of history, I've never had that actually. And so what does that feel like? You're a historian and here you are, like, it's this direct connection to your ancestors.
Yeah. Oh, that's a hard question, Susan.
Yeah.
It's something that I still am sort of figuring out what that means. I have really, really strong memories of my grandmother in particular. And she passed away before I started 5th grade. So a lot of the questions that now, I would give a lot to be able to ask her. And I wish that I could know her as an adult. So I carry those. And so I think it's very bittersweet in the simplest way. There's this real power, I think, in being able to learn about her and be in this space where she was. And then there's a real sadness that's there. That's okay. And it's a sadness that doesn't need to, go away. I think it's a powerful kind of motivating feeling. But just to be in this place, and I've now spent a lot of time at Heart Mountain. When we were there the first time together, when Dakota Russell, who as the executive director out there, was sort of walking me through the registry and actually found my family, and I'd never seen that before. That was only my 2nd time there, and now I've spent a lot of time at Heart Mountain, and it's always this feeling of like, I love being here. There's something that for me is just peace giving, and it just feels like I have space to think about these questions and think about my family. But I also think about the fact that, I think I say this in the film, my grandmother probably hated that place. She probably never wanted to go back. And, both her and my grandfather would probably be like, why are you spending time here? What are you doing? And so I think holding that tension for me as both a person and then as a historian is really important, just to remember that there's so much that we won't know. And so carrying silences and carrying the complexity of the past that we won't have access to is such an important way to, I think, have this omoiyari, like be able to think about other people and have that kind of humility and responsibility.
I have a question for you, Erin. What do you think your dad thinks of you spending a lot of time there?
I mean, I think, and I'm so grateful for my parents, for my whole family, but my parents and my dad especially, because he is okay with me like being annoying about this, honestly, and asking a lot of questions. And he's able to say sometimes like, I don't know. And I think that has been so empowering for me to think about, like, it's okay that I don't know these things. I can learn them, or, if I can't, at least I'm trying. But when I first started doing a lot of this work, I was a little nervous to talk to my dad about it, because it's his parents, it's his side of the family. It's, a lot of his choices that led us to growing up, my siblings and I, not in California, not with the Japanese American community. But I'm really grateful to both of my parents, because my mom's the one who often tells me stories about my grandparents.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to a podcast about epigenealogy. You know what that is? Like, it's basically when traumas actually recodes your DNA so that your children protect themselves against things. And this kind of intergenerational trauma, I feel like you have to be pretty removed from it to be able to approach the original trauma with without being debilitated.
Right. So. And we've talked about this, Kay, the generational distance then that, makes it possible for us to ask these things of folks who came before that, maybe our parents wouldn't. But yeah, absolutely.
I think, Kay, that relates to how you talk about in the story that, it was a big deal for you to wear the happy coat when you're going to perform with the tie, that so resonates with me. I know that, because if you wear that happy coat, you look like you're from Japan, well, okay, if I wear it, I look like I'm from Japan, and I'm not from Japan, and my parents aren't from Japan. So, but if someone else wears it, it's kind of like a fashion statement, right? If you're not Japanese, but it immediately puts you as an outsider when we dress in these kind of what would be called cultural clothes. And so, and it's something in us that we don't want to I think it comes from maybe incarceration, at least with Japanese. You don't want to stick out like that. You don't want to look like a foreigner. You want to look like an American. And so you shy away from that. You try to hide and suppress that part of yourself.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys had the same thing, but when I was younger, I had a problem of congregating with Asian people. Like I didn't like to be, oh, look at that group of Asians. You know?
Yeah.
Well, even though in college I did live with a bunch of Asians, but like I didn't like the idea of like being recognized as a bunch of Asians, for some reason.
I actually grew up in an Asian American community in Gardena, so that's what I grew up with. But even within that, there's just a lot of differences. So like my grandparents weren't in incarceration camps. They were in Hawaii. So that was a completely different story that happened there. But anyway, so what I also wanted to ask you that I think that artists serve as a conduit to society to really get in touch with a wide range of emotions on a really deep level. And I'm wondering, both of you, maybe you touched on it a little, but what is something that really stands out for you in this process? Maybe it's a specific conversation you had with someone, or the courage that you felt from people, or just like you were saying, Erin, the feeling of the place was telling you something. What is something that you really hope is conveyed in the film that people can connect to in a deeper way through your having experienced it?
I could start, I guess.
Yes.
So in this film, one of the big points I bring up is that this loss of language and culture, within these camps was something that was, I think, pretty shocking to me. I didn't really realize that there's a whole generation of West Coast, Japanese Americans who really don't speak Japanese, or like really, and it never occurred to me how much culture there was in the camps until I went and looked at pictures and looked at items, and they tried to keep as much as they can, but then ultimately, because they had to assimilate and they're still viewed as the enemy, in order to reintegrate into society, they were kind of internally and externally just kind of suppressed. And I think that was like very that was impactful to me, because I didn't really realize that until I went there and started to realize that this is a big and also religious persecution. Well, like a lot of them were Buddhists, and so like entering the camps, like I would say probably 50% were probably Buddhists, and then ended up being mostly Christian. I don't have the statistics for that. Duncan would, but
yes, they had smaller congregating areas smaller areas that
but that's an angle, but these are things like it's a culture war.
That's
what assimilation is, and unfortunately white culture is has always been the dominant hegemony. So
yeah how about you, Erin?
Oh, I mean, I think one of my most favorite Ishibashi songs is Theme from Jerome. That's what it's called. And I think some of why that song is beautiful. And, I remember like being in the car with you as you were working out that main theme and humming it and saying like, doesn't this sound kind of Japanesey, but it's also got this like Southern piece to it. So it's a beautiful song. But I think what I love about it is I remember when I was little asking my dad if he spoke any Japanese, and him saying to me, no, because I hated Japanese school. I stopped going. He also grew up in Gardena, Susan.
Really? Oh my God.
Yes. And, so he grew up with all Japanese American families, but he said, I remember my mom used to sing this lullaby to us in Japanese, and he sang it to me when I was a kid. I don't remember it, and I haven't actually asked him about this since, but that song has this, talks about this loss of language, but this, mother holding on to this lullaby and these words for her kids. And I think that the first time I heard this song from Kay, I like teared up, and it really just hit me right here. And I think because I had never told Kay that story, but still it was in this song and just spoke to me so much to what I carried about, my family. And so I think connect that back to your question, Susan, so much of what I've learned from being around Kay and being part of this film is the way that, you know, stories and history can be told in so many different mediums and so many different voices, and how important that is. Because hearing a song, like I would have never expected to hear a song with the name of a concentration camp from World War II, you know, Arkansas, in the title of it. And so I remember driving one day and listening to this song and being like, this is crazy that this site that's a research site for me is also in the title of a pop song. Like that is so cool. And how many more people are going to think about Jerome or think about these places having heard this song? And so I think maybe this sounds really, you know, basic and that everybody knows this, but the way that art and music, or you know, poetry, all of these things are such important ways to tell these stories and to reach more people and reach people in different ways. I think that's such a beautiful and powerful part of the film that is so obvious. And also just at this point, Kaoru, so much of who you are is this, like, I'm an incredible musician and artist, but I also can make you question, you know, the grounds of the country that you call home, or whatever. So I think that to me is one of the most powerful parts of this film.
Yeah, someone in another one of our films said this quote, something to the effect that if you speak to someone in their learned language, you speak to their mind, and if you speak to them in their mother tongue, you reach their heart. And that's so poignant if you think about having to suppress your native language that you have grown up with, that your mother spoke to you, you know, you're missing that part.
That scene in Ratatouille at the end where he makes the ratatouille and he's like, I won't eat this peasant dish. And then he takes a bite and he's reminded of like his like mother's home cooking. Is it like that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I have to say, Kaoru, I don't really know Japanese. So that's lost in 3 generations in my lineage. You know, and you at least have that, and I'm sure your daughter has that too.
A little bit. I mean, that's the kind of thing you can always relearn it and bring it back, and I think that's the kind of thing that it's becoming more and more acceptable to be not all of it, whatever all of it is. You know?
Yeah, because there's a lot of culture in language. So speaking of parents, I love your parents. They're wonderful. And I really, yeah, we'll tell them that I think they're wonderful. And I really like that your mom, she says this, she wisely cautions that we need to guard against our tendencies towards prejudices. So insightful. And also I'm thinking that most of this film was filmed before a lot of the societal shifts we've had from COVID. So for both of you, are you both hopeful after this journey? Like, here we are. Do you think US society is going to embrace this idea of Omoiyari and, you know, this consideration of the needs of others? I mean, it's kind of almost ironic to talk about that now.
I guess I can start. Yeah, I mean, the film that you just saw, and it ends with a positive note, and also the piece I wrote, improvisations on EO 906, and all these things in all my concerts, I always end it on a positive note, because I think it's something about, you can wallow in a lot of, you know, the misery of the past, to the point that it's because human beings have been doing all these awful things, aggressive, brutal things to each other, even today happening. But like, there's no end to that. And so like, I think to kind of see ourselves as like above that, and to be able to cherish like healing, and to have like rebuilding communities, and to be able to have compassion for a stranger, or to kind of like help yourself and your community, is something that's like very fragile and something to be cherished. And then on top of that, that's what gets me excited about, you know, where we are as a community. But the other thing, the one statistic that I played about putting it in the final scene of the movie, but I ended up not doing it, there's a statistic that the census recently says that over 50% of all school-age children are people of color. And this has kind of like shaped my whole worldview, my nation view, you know, in that like America's really changing very rapidly within this generation. You know, there's going to be a huge shift like in tax paying power and like political power. And I think we're just going to have to be more tolerant.
Mm-hmm.
And for minorities, that's extremely exciting. For a certain aspect of the white population, it's not. It's scary, honestly, you know, but I think it's something that's inevitable, and it's actually something that will strengthen us and unify us, you know, to become a beautiful, more diverse nation. So I'm optimistic. Also, I think COVID is almost, it's on its way out, so I'm excited about that too.
Yeah, I think we're in that messy transition point, right, where the shift happens. Yeah. What do you think, Erin?
Oh, well, I'm sorry. My internet's getting a little spotty. So if I cut out, I'm sorry. I think I always appreciate and admire, Kay, your optimism, because I think it's hard. It's been hard the last 2 years and even up before then. You know, it's hard to be someone who studies history and also cares about the present and the future. And it's hard to feel hopeful sometimes. But I think there is a lot of hope to be found in the joyful moments that we see around us, even in the midst of COVID and in the midst of, you know, ongoing racial violence on so many different levels and just sort of the overall state of the world and global capitalism. But there are still moments of joy, just as there were moments of joy, you know, when folks were incarcerated in Wyoming and elsewhere. And so I think finding those moments, holding on to those moments are really important. And then also just thinking about the communities that we can touch. I think, Kay, one of the most powerful things about Omoiyari is there are so many communities that you touch, right? There's so many folks who come to your show. Sorry, I think I'm cutting out, but I think there is a lot of hope to be found in community as well. And in having these conversations and inviting folks in to hear these stories about the past that, you know, I really do believe have the power to make us think differently about how we engage with each other in the world today. And so there is reason to be hopeful, I think, especially in spite of a lot of the darkness that's around us.
Yeah, very cool. So Kay, before we end, I want you to talk a little bit about Immigrant EP. That was a COVID project, and maybe it involved talking to a lot of communities, maybe, or just one other very significant person.
During COVID, I mean, this kind of touches on what Erin was saying. I really got into, well, all the tours stopped, and because I spent so much time in Wyoming and Montana, I did a big road trip, and I kind of spent a lot of time, and there's a town called Emigrant in Montana. And Emigrant is this beautiful town right north of the gate of Yellowstone. Beautiful valley called Paradise Valley. And I read this book, a frontier book of like this trapper. His name's Jeremiah Johnson, and he's like a famous trapper, like woodsman, you know, survivalist. And in this book, he's also known as the Crow Killer, you know. And he had these interactions with me. He also had like a flathead wife, and so he had all these interactions. Talks about his interactions as a frontiersman, and it's the most brutal, like amazing story I had ever heard, you know. And that kind of gave me this imagination about like kind of understanding what America, the frontier was like, you know. And I started reading up about like indigenous histories and so Erin, like a lot of things, I was starting to get into this idea that like a lot of you know, the American westward push, you know, was extremely violent, you know. And it was just like for everybody, it was like a battle of survival for the indigenous people. And it was these white settlers who, they weren't like racist. They're just, you know, they're kind of like, it was this, they're making a better life for themselves. Also just like manifest destiny and pushing westward, you know, with all these ideals. But it was extremely violent and totally brutal. And it's like, there's a lot of historians who are conservative, you know, who see this as just like, look, we're a bunch of animals. This is what happened. The indigenous people were violent towards us, and then we overtook them, you know. And then this is a perspective that a lot of historians have. You know, Bill O'Reilly writes books about history, which are, quite interesting. But he's a conservative. He's awful, anyways. But what I'm saying is, sorry. Long story short, I started getting into the headspace of that. This is like a very dangerous place to be, because it's like, it doesn't matter like how awful. It's fascinating to see how awful people were to each other and how easily we can be brutal to each other. But it's, what do we do now as redistributing wealth and helping people who are really, really down and do not have these resources because of whatever happened, and it's that's like, what do we do now as modern human beings? And so I think a lot of that album came out of immigrant means to leave somewhere in search of a new home. And it's this kind of thing that, in many ways, like I was also leaving, so I just gotten divorced anyways, but I was leaving town and kind of looking for a place. In many ways, it's kind of like we all look for a new place, and despite like what all our hardships, we make a home for ourselves, and then it's kind of like from there we can like learn to thrive.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back and relates. Well, maybe we'll end on this note from the words from your mom, that we just sort of have to always be open and vigilant about our tendencies to be fearful, to not trust each other, and if we're aware of that, we can maybe reach a little higher and go more towards the compassion and understanding of each other. Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for this conversation and taking the time to join us here. I hope.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah.